Amen. Hey, y'all. Good morning. My name's Will. I'm one of the pastors here. Good to be with you this morning. So, 2 years ago this week, we got a phone call that said, hey, we would like to send you to a new church. And at the time, my wife and I were at a church in Virginia, and we were a long way from our family, but we'd been through the pandemic with this. We felt like we'd been to war with those people. We weren't looking for a move. We hadn't asked for one. So they called and said, hey, we'd like to put you up for something. And I said, well, we're really not interested in that. The only thing we'd be interested for is if you sent us to a church that was in Knoxville and had contemporary worship and was a place we could stay a long time because our kids are getting ready to go in the school system. And they were like, yep, got it. Exactly. That's what we've got in mind. And I was like, okay, cool. But see, in Methodist world, they don't tell you where it is. So it's just, it's a great exercise in faith to say, okay, we'll say yes to this. And then there was a month that went by. And of course that month, I would do my church in Virginia, and then I would go home, and I was watching 6 different Methodist churches in Knoxville that had contemporary worship, including this one stopped live streaming right about this time. So I was like, well, okay, I don't know. And then it was a month after that where they called, that was the end of February, then they called us the end of March, and they said, we want to send you to PAL, which, man, we were and still are just elated by all of that. But then what happens is your life starts moving really fast. So they called us at the end of March and said, we want to send you to PAL, and you start there July 1st. So you've got April and May and June to get your entire life picked up and sent. And so they said, we want you to meet it's called the Staff Parish Relations Committee. If you're unfamiliar, it's like an HR committee. We want you to meet that group here at the church. They want to make sure you're not a crazy person. You want to make sure we're not crazy people, all that other stuff, right? And they said, when do you want to set it up? And I said, well, listen, we'll take as soon as possible. So we went the next week on a Thursday night. We went 6 days later on a Thursday night. Recovery was happening in this space, and Alex and I met with the Staff Parish Relations Committee in the sanctuary over there. I remember Ann Sinnott had on a Buc-ee's t-shirt, and I thought, oh, I could be the pastor of this church. And so we did that, and then the next morning we met with a realtor. And I remember, shout out to Savannah Price, who sold us our house. We met her at Mahalo, and we sat down for coffee, and she looked at us and goes, buckle up. And we looked all over Powell for a day. And one of the places where we looked was this, it was a small new construction that it was a frame and a foundation. And she said, if you want this house, you have to make an offer on it today. And she was like, this is a lot of information. Take some time. Alex and I went over here to Aubrey's and sat down. I wanted to throw up. It's the least enjoyable meal I've ever had at Aubrey's. We looked around, we did all this stuff. I've only been a pastor as a grown-up. So a lot of places the church owns the house and you don't get to pick. So I'd never bought a house before. Alex bought a house, and then she got with me, and then she stopped buying houses and started living in, church-owned houses and all this other stuff. So we went back over and snuck back onto the construction site and stood in the gravel driveway and prayed, and we made an offer on it, and we got it. And then I wanted to throw up some more. Because you're just it was a day. And you think about the way God works and all these things of if we didn't say, I'll take the meeting on that day, that night, and meet with a realtor the next morning, then we would be living somewhere else. And frankly, I'm not sure where we would be living if we weren't in that house. Sometimes God works just in these very direct ways. And we really like our house, but whenever someone says, by the way, when Savannah, who sold us our house, said, you're the pastor at Powell Church, huh? She's like, whenever anybody asks you where you live, you should tell them I live next to the Corn Pone Tavern, and people will get a great kick out of that, which that joke has not missed one time that I've told it. So whenever someone asks us, what do you think about your house? The first thing I want to say is truly, I don't know where we would be if we weren't here in this place, in a very direct, how God works in and through our lives. So I tell you that story to say, everything else I'm getting ready to tell you this morning is a little skewed by if we don't live where we live, I'm not sure where we would be living at this point in time. Our church is walking through the Gospel of Luke, and we've been doing this since Advent. We've been walking through it verse by verse since January 1st. If you're on that journey with us, and you've been doing the readings every day this week, you know that Jesus says some difficult things this week, and some things that seem, I'm going to say, harsh. And I think what's helpful for us in trying to unpack and figure out not what does this say about other people, but what does this say about me? One of the things that is most helpful to us is this metaphor of your life as a house. Think about your life as a house. So take and picture like your dream house. Whether it's like on the beach or in the mountains or just, what kind of floor plan and what kind of cabinets and all that good stuff. Think about your dream house. You got it? Okay, now take that and throw that away, okay? Because unless you're living in your dream house, which kudos to you and the Lord if you are, but what usually ends up being a better metaphor for our lives, your life as a house, what usually ends up being a better metaphor is, the place where you live right now. And you may be in a situation where you're like, I don't know where else we would be if we were not in this place. Or maybe you're new to it and it's still fresh. Maybe you've lived in this house and your ancestors lived in this house before you. Maybe you're in a place that you love. Maybe you're in a place that you don't. But think about how your life is reflected by your place that you live. Not just your status or your income or whatever, but like, how does your house reflect your life? What does your life look like as a reflection of a house? Also, everything I'm getting ready to say, I feel like we should do a tour of my office after this so you can see how messy it is. I am in need of help. Not someone who is here to tell you how to do it. I am a co-struggler with messiness. My kids are 6 and 3. I am a co-struggler in, it looks like a bomb went off in here sometimes. So I get all of that. This, I think, is the metaphor that helps us the most. We're going to walk through some of Luke 11. I want to show it to you in the Message this morning. This is Eugene Peterson's contemporary paraphrase that I think helps us with some of this language. Here's Luke 11 in verse 24, 25, and 26. Jesus says, when a corrupting spirit is expelled from someone, or traditionally, when a demon is cast out from someone, when a corrupting spirit is expelled from someone, it drifts along through the desert looking for an oasis, looking for some unsuspecting soul it can bedevil. When it doesn't find anyone, it says, well, I'll go back to my old haunt. On return, it finds the person swept and dusted, but vacant. Swept and dusted, but vacant. It then runs out and rounds up seven other spirits dirtier than itself, and they all move in, whooping it up. That person ends up far worse than if he'd never gotten cleaned up in the first place. Think about this language of swept and dusted, but vacant. If we're thinking about our life as a house, thinking about how the place where you live right now represents your life and that sort of stuff, chances are you've got some space, some place, something in there somewhere that could use a good sweeping and dusting, right? On occasion, we don't notice these things until someone else points it out to us, maybe. Someone close to you, perhaps, but someone who lives there with you, perhaps. But often we have opportunities for sweeping and dusting, and of course, that's a good place where it needs to start. Now, like I said, I've been a pastor since I was 24. I lived in houses that churches owned for most of my time. When I started out, I was in a very remote place, a very remote community in Virginia, a tiny middle of the nowhere place, but they did have a house for the pastor, and I lived there for 6 years. And I was a single guy for most of those 6 years, never really all the people I dated were long distance things. So it was really just me in the house in that space. And the good people of that church will tell you that in some ways, having a single guy in a house for 6 years is way harder on that house than having a family of like 25 people in that space. Because you just I was young and dumb then, now I'm just kind of middle-aged and dumb, and like, you just don't think about or see things. So back then, when the time came for me to move to a new church back then, they don't do this anymore, but they used to do this thing of, it's like they never wanted to leave people without a pastor for even a second. So it was like the old pastor would move out in the morning and the new pastor would move in the afternoon. This crazy kind of system that thankfully they don't do anymore. But I remember like it was time for me to move. I was moving to a church in Athens, Tennessee, and I thought I'd done a pretty good job cleaning up the house, you know? New pastor's coming in, all this stuff. And I moved out in the morning and the new pastor was coming in the afternoon. And that morning, there was a team of ladies that came into the house. And they were like dressed for business, you know, like and they came in and I thought, well, this is really kind. It's a good reflection of this place. Like they looked out for me. They knew how young and dumb I was, right? And I remember they came in and the first thing they did was they started cleaning the baseboards. And I looked at them and I thought, never in my life has it occurred to me that someone should clean a baseboard. Like I could have lived here 1,000 years and I never would have thought, you know, someone should take care of those baseboards. So sometimes we are unaware of the things that need sweeping and dusting in our lives and need someone who loves us, cares about us, knows that we're young and dumb, whatever the case may be, to come in and help us. But often we are aware that there are things in our lives that need to be swept and dusted. If you think of your life as a house, you've got things in there that need to be swept and dusted. But the story that Jesus is telling here is when something bad comes out, a corrupting spirit or a demon or just a bad, whatever your theology on those things might be, or even if you're unsure of what your theology of those things are, when something bad comes out, if the space is swept and dusted but vacant, if the space is swept and dusted but not filled with something else, swept and dusted, but we would say not filled with something else, good, if it's just get the bad out, but don't fill that space with something else, then we are incredibly prone to that bad eventually finding its way back in plus interest. We have, my big dumb brain will tell you this. If I'm trying to lose weight and I think to myself, don't eat the brownies, don't eat the brownies, don't eat the brownies, don't eat the brownies, don't eat the, you know what my big dumb brain hears? Brownies, 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 brownies. And I can sweep and dust and get them out of the house and all that stuff. But if I don't fill that space with something else, sooner or later, those brownies are coming back, baby, with icing, right? It's like, this is whatever you're like, this is binging, relapsing, rebounding, whatever the case may be. If it's just swept and dusted and not filled with something else, we as human beings, young or old, whatever the case may be, we are prone to have those things come back. If we only clean out the bad and don't focus on what goes in that space now instead. Swept and dusted but vacant, we are prone to these things coming back. It's not just psychology, that's Jesus. So, how do we fill the space, right? He'll go on to say this a few verses later. This is verse 33, still in the Message here. No one lights a lamp and hides it in a drawer. A lamp is put on a lampstand so those entering the room have light to see where they're going. Your eye is a lamp. It lights up your whole body. If you live wide-eyed in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a musty cellar. Keep your eyes open. Keep your lamp burning so you don't get musty and murky. Keep your life as well lighted as your best lighted room. So if you just sweep and dust but leave the space vacant, things are prone to come in. How do we fill that space? Jesus goes on with this metaphor to talk about how we light up our places where we spend time, light up our homes, light up our lives. And he says that your eye is the lamp of your body, and ties it to not just the things we do and the choices we make, but the way we see the world. If you live wide-eyed in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. But if you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a musty cellar. I think most of us would agree this morning that we would prefer not to be musty, right? Musty and murky. No one thinks to themselves, I'd really like to be a basement, And even we aren't meant to live in basements. Now, as a proud alum of my parents' basement for a time, right? Maybe you were too. Sometimes that's the season you're in. Sometimes that's what you've got to do, those kinds of things. But in the long run, when I ask you to picture your dream house, I think none of us were like, man, a basement would be so great. Like if I could just be in the bunker, my whole, that would just be amazing. Now, there are moments when we may want that, or if you're averse to tornadoes and things like that, maybe a basement is high on your list. But there's this truth that Jesus invites us to keep our life as well lighted as your best lighted room. So when we talk about the eye as the lamp of the body, again, it's not just to say your eye is the lamp of your body, so don't look at bad stuff. Yes, of course, don't look at bad stuff, but also, how do we see the world? What kind of light are we letting in? Because if it's just, my eye is my lamp in my body, so I'm not gonna look at bad stuff anymore. I'm not gonna look at those brownies. I'm not gonna look at whatever the equivalent of that may be for you. And it's not that those things aren't bad. It's not that pornography isn't bad or that hate speech, other kinds of things that we might let in. It's not that those things aren't bad. It's that if all we do is just think to ourselves, okay, as a Christian, my job is not to look at bad stuff, and don't spend any time considering, also, how do I see the world? Because you can work really hard to not look at bad stuff, but end up pretty squinty-eyed in greed and distrust. You don't even have to be a hoarder, and you can sweep and dust and all that other stuff, but still in some ways kind of be in the basement of your life, of just kind of holding on tight to some things and waiting and mistrusting and whatever the case may be. You can clean out the basement, but then still live there. And Jesus invites us instead to say, our job, and we're talking about filling spaces, is to let the light in. To let perhaps other people in. The best way a mess gets cleaned up is with help. Maybe you've got a team of ladies in your life that will come and clean your baseboards that you didn't even know needed to be cleaned. The best way a mess gets cleaned up and a space gets filled is when we let the light of other people into some of those spaces. Now, Jesus famously will go on here, he does it in the Gospel of Matthew as well, to go after the Pharisees and the scribes for these kinds of things of making something look a certain way on the outside, but the inside of it is still a mess. He says, woe to you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You tithe on the smallest things, you're tithing on your spices. It'd be like tithe, I'm gonna give 10% of my salt, that sort of thing. You tithe on the smallest things to check the box, but you neglect the most important things like justice and the love of God. And woe to you, you are like unmarked graves, which people step on, the green grass, without even realizing that it is rotten underneath. So Jesus speaks against this idea directly of make it look good on the outside, but neglect what's really going on the inside. And I think these are two of our biggest tendencies as human beings when it comes to thinking about our life as a house. We can know we need to clean out the basement and we can clean it out, but then still live there. swept and dusted, but just vacant and not letting light in to fill those spaces. Or we can clean the front yard, clean the front door, make everything look really great on the outside of our lives. But we've missed on the inside where we actually need to spend the most amount of time. The places where we're actually living, the places where we spend the most amount of our thoughts, our energy, all that stuff is still a mess. But instead we spend time and energy, I spend time and energy making it look a certain way on the outside. And so finally he finishes this whole section in verse 52 by saying this: "You're hopeless, religion scholars. You took the key of knowledge, but instead of unlocking doors, you locked them. You won't go in yourself, and you won't let anyone else in either." What happens a lot of times, in my experience in Christianity, is we spend so much time focusing on, we've talked about this in many different facets before, we spend so much time focusing on, here are the things you're supposed to say no to. And a good mark, a good outward appearance, the way people know you're a Christian is if you say no to these 7 things, or these 107 things. And we don't spend time talking about the things that we're invited to say yes to, the life-giving, light-giving things that we're invited to say yes to. Because Jesus says, if all we do is sweep and dust, try to sweep out the bad, try to sweep out the dusty, try to sweep out all that stuff, but we don't let this childlike way of looking at the world and wonder and belief in, we don't let light in, we don't let other people in, then sooner or later that stuff is prone to coming back. And he finishes this metaphor by saying, the people who are supposed to know the most about this, who have the key of knowledge, they lock the doors behind them. They don't seek to let people into the innermost places where the real work is done, changing hearts and lives, vulnerability, confession, those kinds of things. We lock that away. We don't go in ourselves, and we won't let anyone else in either. Because I think it's also true that the more we're focused on the way the outside of it is supposed to look, the more that becomes our focus for other people too, right? If we're more and more convinced that this is supposed to look a certain kind of way, and it's about how it looks on the outside, then we'll start looking at other people and asking if they look the right way on the outside. And along the way, we've neglected the innermost work that's there to be done, and ultimately no one ends up getting to come into the house. You can't just clean out the bad stuff. It's about what kind of light do we put in its place. Where in our lives, sure, are there things that need to be swept and dusted? We talked before about the proximity in the New Testament of the Greek word for hell and the understanding of trash. So if you've got styrofoam in your life, you've got styrofoam in your house, stuff that just needs to go, then sure, sweeping and dusting is where we start. But also, how do we fill those places with light? How do we let light into those spaces? How do we let people into those spaces? So we don't spend all our time and energy just focused on, I got to get that bad out, but might come to see a new and better way of living, of vulnerability, of those kinds of things. And where are the places where we are so consumed with how it looks on the outside that we've missed that Jesus is fully aware of how we all look on the inside anyway, and loves us and gives himself for us in all these spaces anyway, so that we don't have to spend the rest of our lives just worried about how it looks to other people, but might be in the space of letting light in so that our lives might be as well lit as our best lit room. We are not called to be people who live in the basement, but people who are letting the light of Christ into all these facets of our lives, that we might encourage others to do the same as well.